Let me tell you about the most advanced educational system in the galaxy. No, seriously. Stop laughing. The Galactic Educational Oversight Committee had spent exactly 3,427 years perfecting their universal standard learning matrix. And by perfecting, I mean they had created the most soul-crushing, creativity-murdering machine ever conceived by sentient beings. Committee Chair Vex Talar took immense pride in this achievement. Picture a 7-foot-tall praying mantis wearing a business suit, and you're halfway to understanding his natural charm. He ruled the education sector with the iron fist of someone who had never actually been in a classroom but had read extensively about theoretical pedagogy. Pip, he clicked at his assistant, a nervous little blob creature who vibrated with anxiety. Remind me again why we're entertaining this ridiculous request from the Sol system. Pip consulted his datapad with trembling tentacles. The humans have applied for inclusion in the Galactic Education Network, sir. Their application was unusual. Unusual how? They used words like fun and creativity in their curriculum proposal. Also, their representative drew little smiley faces in the margins. Vex Talar's compound eyes literally crossed. In 3 millennia of educational oversight, no one had ever suggested learning should be enjoyable. The very concept was absurd. Learning was serious business. It involved memorization, regurgitation, and strict adherence to predetermined thought patterns. The galaxy had prospered under this system, producing countless generations of compliant but predictable citizens who never questioned authority or thought outside their designated mental boxes. Sir, Pip squeaked, the representative arrives today for the standard observation period. The committee had established the observation protocol centuries ago. Species seeking membership would send a delegate to witness the superiority of galactic education. Usually these delegates were so overwhelmed by the efficiency and order that they immediately abandoned their primitive teaching methods. Excellent, Vex Talar rubbed his mandibles together. Another species will see the light of proper educational methodology. Schedule the human for a tour of our finest classroom. Professor Click Taz's advanced algorithmic recitation should sufficiently demonstrate our superiority. Around the pristine conference table sat the other committee members. Windar, an ancient turtle-like being whose species had been reciting the same mathematical theorems for 10,000 years without variation. Zara, whose people came from a world where questioning authority was literally illegal. And a handful of other representatives, all united in their absolute certainty that education was about conformity, not comprehension. What do we know about this human species? Asked Quindar, his voice like grinding stone. Pip nervously shuffled through his files. They're relatively young, technologically impressive for their age, but their educational methods are chaotic. They encourage something called critical thinking and allow students to challenge their instructors. The silence that followed was deafening. Several committee members made sounds that could only be described as disgusted. Challenging instructors? The very idea was heretical. Teachers were the dispensers of approved knowledge. Students were receptacles. This was the natural order. How barbaric, whispered Zara, though something flickered in her eyes that might have been curiosity. Vex Talar straightened his tie. Well, we'll soon cure them of such primitive notions. The Universal Standard Learning Matrix has never failed to convert a species to proper educational practices. By the end of the observation period, this human will be begging to implement our methods. He was wrong. Spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. But at that moment, basking in the glow of bureaucratic superiority, Vex Talar had no idea that one substitute teacher from Earth was about to turn their perfect system inside out, upside down, and sideways into next week. The committee adjourned, confident in their superiority. After all, what could possibly go wrong? Jake Martinez stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately knew he was in trouble. Not the good kind of trouble that comes from accidentally starting a food fight in the faculty lounge, no, but the soul-crushing kind that comes from walking into a building designed by aliens who apparently believed fun was a communicable disease. The Galactic Education Center stretched before him like a monument to boredom. Everything was white, sterile, and arranged at perfect 90-degree angles. Even the plants looked like they had been disciplined into geometric compliance. Jake, wearing his favorite wrinkled khakis and a t-shirt that read "I survived another day of teaching," felt like a beautiful disaster waiting to happen. "Mr. Martinez?" A nervous blob approached him. "I am Pip, assistant to committee chair Vex Talar. Welcome to the most advanced educational facility in the galaxy." Jake looked around at the sterile corridors filled with silent, perfectly aligned students moving in formation. "Advanced, huh? Looks more like a prison had a baby with a hospital and raised it in a library." Pip made a sound like a deflating balloon. What? Is that good?" "Buddy, I've taught in public schools with broken air conditioning, no budget, and kids hopped up on energy drinks. This place has all the warmth of a tax audit." Jake patted Pip's gelatinous shoulder. "But hey, at least it's clean." The meeting with the committee was everything Jake expected and worse. Vex Talar loomed over the conference table like a disapproving insect overlord, flanked by his equally rigid colleagues. Jake slumped into his chair and immediately put his feet up on the polished surface. "Mr. Martinez," Vex Talar began, "we are pleased to offer Earth this opportunity to observe proper educational methodology. Perhaps you could begin by explaining your primitive teaching practices." Jake grinned. "Well, Vex, can I call you Vex? Great. So basically I show up, figure out what the kids actually need to learn, and then try to trick them into thinking it's fun. Revolutionary stuff." "Trick them?" Quindar's ancient voice rumbled with confusion. "Yeah, make learning enjoyable. Like if I'm teaching math, maybe I'll use pizza to explain fractions instead of having them memorize abstract formulas. Kids learn better when they're not falling asleep." The committee exchanged horrified glances. Zara leaned forward, and Jake caught something like interest in her expression. "You make changes based on student needs?" "Lady, I once taught the entire Revolutionary War using Hamilton lyrics because that's what connected with my kids. Education isn't about following some script. It's about meeting learners where they are and helping them grow." Vex Talar's mandibles clicked ominously. "Growth? Students don't grow, Mr. Martinez. They absorb predetermined knowledge packets according to established timelines. Deviation leads to chaos." "Chaos?" Jake laughed. "Buddy, you haven't seen chaos until you've tried to teach 8th graders about photosynthesis right after lunch. But you know what? Sometimes the best learning happens in the messy moments when kids start asking questions you weren't expecting." "Questions," Pip whispered, as if Jake had uttered a curse word. "Yeah, questions. Those things that start with who, what, when, where, why, and how. The stuff that makes brains actually work instead of just storing data like biological hard drives." The meeting continued for another painful hour, with Jake casually dismantling centuries of educational doctrine while the committee grew increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, Vex Talar assigned him to observe Professor Click Taz's model classroom, clearly expecting Jake to be overwhelmed by galactic superiority. "Perfect," Jake said, standing and stretching. "I love seeing how other people teach, always pick up new ideas." As he left, he heard Zara mutter to herself, "New ideas." The phrase hung in the air like a dangerous promise. Professor Click Taz's classroom was a masterpiece of educational oppression. 37 students from various species sat in perfect rows, hands folded, eyes forward, mouths shut. The only sound was the rhythmic clicking of Click Taz's 8 legs as he moved between the desks like a mechanical spider dispensing approved knowledge. Jake stood in the back, watching in growing horror as the class proceeded through what could only be described as intellectual torture disguised as learning. "Today we will recite Theorem 4847 from the Approved Mathematical Concepts Manual," Click Taz announced. "Repeat after me. The square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides." "The square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides," the students chanted in unison, their voices flat and emotionless. "Excellent. Now we will recite this Theorem 57 more times to ensure proper neural pathway formation." Jake couldn't help himself. "Excuse me, Professor?" Click Taz froze mid-click. Students weren't supposed to speak unless spoken to, and observers certainly weren't supposed to interrupt. "Yes?" "Quick question. Do the kids know why this theorem works?" Like, have they ever seen it in action? Why would they need to see it in action? The theorem is correct. Memorization ensures they will recall it when needed. But what if they understood why it works? Jake walked closer to the front of the room. Like, what if we drew some triangles on the board and actually measured them? Showed them how Pythagoras figured this out in the first place? The students' heads turned slightly, following this bizarre conversation. In the back row, a young Zephyrian's eyes widened with something that might have been curiosity. Understanding is inefficient. Taz clicked nervously. Memorization is reliable. Students recite, students learn, students advance. But do they, though? Jake looked around the room at the glazed expressions. Hey kids, who can tell me when you might actually use the Pythagorean theorem in real life? 37 pairs of eyes stared blankly. Several students looked confused by the very concept of a question directed at them. Come on, work with me here. Anyone? Building a house? Navigating space? Figuring out if your furniture will fit through a doorway? A small hand went up. The same Zephyrian from the back row. Taz nearly had an aneurysm. Student designation ZX 7742, you were not given permission to respond. But I think I used it once when my parents were trying to fit a new sleeping platform in our dwelling. We had to make sure it would fit diagonally through the entrance. Jake grinned. Exactly. See? Learning happens when you connect ideas to real experiences. What's your name, kid? Names are inefficient, Taz interjected frantically. Students have designations. Nah, that's weird. Everyone has a name. What do your friends call you? The young Zephyrian looked around nervously. Hi, I'm Zix. But we're not supposed to use names in academic settings. Well, nice to meet you, Zix. That was a great example. Anyone else ever notice triangles in their daily life? More hands started going up. Taz began making distressed clicking sounds as his perfect classroom dissolved into something resembling actual engagement. Students started talking to each other, sharing experiences, making connections between abstract concepts and real-world applications. This is highly irregular, Taz protested. The curriculum does not allow for student interaction during instruction time. Why not? Jake asked. They're learning from each other. That's good teaching right there. But they might share incorrect information. Only approved knowledge sources should be used. Or they might teach each other something you didn't think to include in the curriculum. Sometimes the best insights come from unexpected places. The classroom had transformed. Students were animated, asking questions, building on each other's ideas. It was messy, loud, and absolutely nothing like the sterile perfection the Galactic Education System demanded. And for the first time in centuries, actual learning was happening. Word spread through the Education Center faster than gossip in a small-town faculty lounge. By the time Jake finished observing his second classroom, maintenance drones were reporting unusual acoustic disturbances from multiple learning pods. Students were talking. Worse, they were thinking. Pip burst into Vex Talar's office, vibrating with panic. Sir, we have a situation. The human has created what our systems are classifying as a Category 7 educational anomaly. Impossible. Vex Talar didn't look up from his quarterly efficiency reports. Our system is anomaly-proof. Sir, students in Pod 7 asked their instructor why they needed to memorize the periodic table of elements when they could just look it up. Professor Claxon had to be sedated. Now Vex Talar looked up. They asked why? It gets worse. The contamination is spreading. Students in Pod 12 want to know the historical context behind the mathematical theorems they're memorizing. Pod 15 is experiencing what can only be described as a discussion. And Pod 3. Pip's voice dropped to a horrified whisper. Pod 3 is collaborating. Vex Talar's compound eyes bulged. Emergency committee meeting. Now. 20 minutes later, the committee assembled in crisis mode. Through the observation windows, they could see the chaos spreading through their perfect facility. Students were gathered in groups, gesturing animatedly. Teachers huddled together, looking lost and confused. The orderly hum of recitation had been replaced by the terrifying sound of engaged minds. "This is unprecedented," Quindar rumbled. "In 10,000 years of educational service, I have never seen students exhibit such behavior." "They're thinking," Zara said quietly. "Actually thinking." "It's a disaster," Vex Talar clicked. "We must contain this immediately. Where is the human now?" Jake chose that moment to walk into the conference room, looking remarkably cheerful for someone who had just dismantled a millennia-old institution. "Hey guys, great meeting earlier. Just wanted to chat about what I've been seeing out there." "Mr. Martinez," Vex Talar's voice carried the chill of deep space, "you have violated numerous educational protocols. Students are not responding to standard instruction. Teachers are reporting system failures." "System failures?" Jake laughed. "Buddy, your system was already failing. Those kids were basically zombies before. Now they're actually engaged. That's not a bug, it's a feature." "Engagement is not part of the curriculum," Quindar stated firmly. "Which is exactly the problem." Jake pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. "Look, I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of different approaches. But this?" He gestured toward the windows where students could be seen actively participating in their own education. "This isn't education. This is just expensive memorization. The Universal Standard Learning Matrix has produced countless productive galactic citizens," Vex Talar protested. "Productive, sure. But innovative? Creative? Capable of solving new problems? Because from what I've seen, you've created a galaxy full of very efficient robots who happen to be made of biological material." Before anyone could respond, the conference room doors opened and the most imposing alien Jake had ever seen swept in. Grand Educator Mox Riam was 12 feet tall, covered in silver scales, and radiated the kind of authority that came from crushing dissent for several centuries. "I came as soon as I received the reports." Mox Riam's voice resonated like thunder. "Someone explained to me how one primitive human has managed to disrupt our entire educational framework." Jake raised his hand. "That'd be me. And just for the record, I prefer innovative to primitive." Mox Riam fixed him with a stare that had previously been used to terrorize star systems. "You will explain yourself, human." "Gladly. Your educational system sucks." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake wondered if he'd accidentally broken the universe. Mox Riam's silver scales shifted to a dangerous shade of crimson. In his 300-year career as Grand Educator, no one had ever dared suggest that the Galactic Education System was anything less than perfect. Several committee members made choking sounds. Pip had apparently fainted. "Elaborate," Mox Riam said in a voice that could shatter planets. Jake, either blessed with incredible courage or cursed with terminal stupidity, leaned back in his chair. "Where do I start? You've got kids memorizing facts they don't understand about subjects they'll never use, taught by instructors who are basically biological textbooks. Nobody's learning to think, question, or solve problems they haven't seen before. Our graduates are highly competent in their assigned roles," Quindar interjected. "Assigned roles, exactly. You're not educating them, you're programming them. What happens when they encounter something new? Something that isn't in the manual?" Through the observation windows, they could see the chaos continuing to spread. Students were now moving freely between learning pods, sharing ideas across species lines. Teachers stood in confused clusters, their carefully scripted lesson plans useless in the face of actual curiosity. "This disorder must be contained," Vex Talar clicked frantically. "It's not disorder," Zara spoke up suddenly. All eyes turned to her. "I've been watching the feeds from the learning pods. Test scores are actually improving. Students are making connections between concepts that we never included in the curriculum. They're learning faster." "Impossible," Mox Riam rumbled. Jake stood and walked to the observation window. "Look at them. Really look. When's the last time you saw a student smile in one of your classrooms? When's the last time they asked a question because they were genuinely curious, not because it was scheduled in the lesson plan?" Down in Pod 7, A group of students from different species were working together to build something that looked like a bridge, animatedly discussing load distribution and material properties. Their teacher, Professor Claxon, was actually participating instead of just reciting approved facts. "They're enjoying learning," Jake continued. "Radical concept, I know, but it turns out brains work better when they're engaged instead of sedated." Max Riem moved to the window, his massive form casting a shadow across the room. For a long moment, he watched the unprecedented scene below. Students helping each other. Teachers adapting in real time. The rigid structure of the universal standard learning matrix crumbling into something organic and alive. "In 3 centuries," he said slowly, "I have never seen students exhibit such vitality." "Because you've been treating them like data storage devices instead of thinking beings," Jake said. "Education isn't about downloading information. It's about teaching minds how to work, how to grow, how to tackle problems that don't have predetermined answers." "But without standardization, how do we ensure quality control?" Pip asked, having recovered consciousness. "You don't. That's the beautiful chaos of actual learning. Sometimes students surprise you. Sometimes they come up with solutions you never considered. Sometimes they teach you something new." Quindar shook his ancient head. "This contradicts everything we know about proper educational methodology." "Yeah, well, your methodology has produced a galaxy full of civilizations that haven't had an original idea in centuries. When's the last time anyone invented something truly revolutionary? When's the last time someone questioned the status quo and made things better?" The committee exchanged uncomfortable glances. Innovation had been declining across the galaxy for millennia. Scientific breakthroughs were rare. Art had become formulaic. Even military strategies hadn't evolved in generations. "You're suggesting," Max Riem said carefully, "that our educational system has been inhibiting progress." "I'm not suggesting it. I'm stating it as fact. You've optimized for compliance and efficiency, but you've eliminated the one thing that drives all real advancement, the willingness to ask what if." 3 months later, Jake Martinez sat in his new office at the Galactic Education Center, feet up on a desk that was now covered with coffee rings, doodles, and the organized chaos of someone actually working instead of just managing. His official title was Consultant for Organic Learning Processes, which was bureaucrat speak for the guy who teaches us how to teach. The transformation hadn't been easy. Several committee members had required therapy after witnessing their first collaborative learning session. Professor Click Taz had initially refused to learn student names, claiming it was emotionally inefficient, but had eventually warmed to the idea when he realized students worked harder for teachers who saw them as individuals rather than code numbers. Vexteller knocked on Jake's door, a sound like nervous insects tap dancing. "Mr. Martinez? The quarterly progress reports are ready." "Just Jake, Vex. And please tell me you've got some good news. I could use it after yesterday's faculty meeting." "Actually, yes," Vex Talar, who had gradually evolved from rigid bureaucrat to cautiously optimistic administrator, consulted his datapad. "Student engagement is up 847%. Test scores across all subjects have improved by an average of 340%. Most remarkably, we've had 23 patent applications filed by current students this quarter alone." Jake grinned. "And the teachers?" "Initial resistance has largely faded. Professor Zinthara actually requested permission to redesign her entire curriculum around project-based learning. And yesterday, Professor Claxon asked if he could attend one of your workshops on making math fun. Miracles never cease. What about the other education centers?" That was the real success story. Word of the Earth method had spread across the galaxy faster than a rumor about free lunch in a teacher's lounge. Education centers on dozens of worlds were implementing what they called organic learning protocols. Some traditionalists were resisting, but it was hard to argue with results. Students were thinking. Teachers were adapting. Innovation was returning to civilizations that had been intellectually stagnant for centuries. Zara appeared in the doorway, carrying a stack of reports and wearing what Jake had learned was her version of an excited expression. "Jake, you need to see this. The Arcturus system just reported their first technological breakthrough in 800 years. A group of students designed a new propulsion system as a class project. No kidding? What were they studying? Basic physics. But instead of just memorizing equations, their teacher had them apply the principles to solve real problems. They ended up revolutionizing space travel by accident. Jake laughed. That's the beautiful thing about real education. You never know where it's going to lead. Quindar shuffled in, moving faster than Jake had ever seen the ancient educator move. The Galactic Council wants to officially adopt the Earth method as the new standard for all member worlds. Hold up there, big guy. First rule of the Earth method, there is no standard. Every classroom is different, every student is unique, every teacher has to find their own way to connect. The moment you standardize it, you've killed what makes it work. But how will we ensure consistency? Vex Talar asked, his old bureaucratic instincts surfacing. You don't. You ensure quality by training teachers to think, adapt, and care about their students. You measure success not by how well kids can regurgitate facts, but by how well they can solve problems, think critically, and keep learning throughout their lives. Jake looked out his window at the education center below. Students moved freely between learning spaces, working in groups, asking questions, making mistakes, and discovering things that weren't in any curriculum. Teachers roamed among them, facilitating rather than dictating, learning alongside their students. It was messy. It was chaotic. It was loud and unpredictable, and absolutely nothing like the sterile perfection the galaxy had once considered ideal. It was also the most beautiful thing Jake had ever seen. You know what the funny thing is? He said to his unlikely collection of alien colleagues. Earth's education system isn't even that great. We've got our own problems, our own bureaucracy, our own resistance to change. But at least we never forgot that learning is supposed to be about growth, not programming. Mox Riem's voice came from the doorway. Perhaps that is why your species was chosen to teach us. Nobody chose us, boss. We just happened to be too stubborn and too chaotic to accept that there was only one right way to do things. Sometimes being a little primitive has its advantages. As the galaxy's most advanced civilization slowly learned to embrace the beautiful chaos of actual education, Jake Martinez, substitute teacher from Earth, put his feet up and watched the future unfold. It was going to be messy, unpredictable, and absolutely magnificent. And for the first time in millennia, nobody knew exactly what would happen next. Which was exactly the point.